Hey kittens, it is Kat from Fit Kitty Tries, and today I have a really fun video. We're going to be talking about taxes. Canadian taxes, to be specific. So I have a Etsy store. I live in Canada, British Columbia specifically. It is pouring rain out right now. And I just had my fiscal year end, which is August for me, so it is now time to get ready to prepare a GST return. And this is my first time doing a GST return for my company, my Etsy small business. And it's really confusing, guys. So I just started with like trying to figure out what reports I need to pull in order to figure out what GST I've collected, what GST I need to remit, what GST or like what taxes Etsy has collected on my behalf. So confusing. Etsy made some big changes to how they collect taxes in Canada in July of 2022, and honestly, they it up and screwed it over for us Canadians. So I'm sure you've probably heard or seen on forums people talking about this. It just makes it really complicated, and there's a lot of different nuances and a lot of things to misunderstand, honestly. So I've spent the last like couple days, many hours, many tabs open, reading forums, chatting with Etsy support to figure out the whole tax situation for Canadians on Etsy, and I've compiled it all here in a nice little video for you guys. I even made a slideshow because I couldn't even keep track of it in my head. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, as I always say, the best person to learn from is somebody who's just a couple steps ahead of you, which is why I created this YouTube channel, and I'm trying to document as much as possible for you guys my journey here. I live in Vancouver. I quit my job a year and a half ago, and I am a broke but thriving entrepreneur living in rainy Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia. So before we get into it, let me just say I am not, by no means am I a tax specialist, or should any of this information be taken as tax advice or business advice for submitting your GST return. Definitely consult a tax specialist if you have questions, but this is the information that I've gathered from the internet and from what I know, and it's just kind of a summary of basic information that you should know as being a Canadian Etsy seller. So basically, let's talk about who needs to report tax and who needs to remit GST in Canada. If you are a small business that does less than $30,000 in revenue every year, you don't need to collect GST, you don't need to report anything. You don't need to worry until you get a little bigger. So just focus on growing your business if that's your goal. But if you have done $30,000 or more in revenue, again, that's revenue, that's not your profit. That's how much sales, how much you invoice people for, or show on receipts or whatever, bill people for. Then you do need to register for GST and remit taxes every year. So I've got this little chart here that shows all the different tax rates in Canada. So every province has got their own thing going on. You'll see most of them are GST or HST. HST is a harmonized sales tax, which incorporates GST, and both GST and HST just get remitted to the federal government, the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency. So you don't need to worry about registering in those provinces to collect taxes or remitting to those provinces. Let's talk about the provinces that have their own thing going on, which is British Columbia, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. They each have their own PST rates, and they're charged separately. So you remit the GST to Canada Revenue Agency, and then the PST gets remitted to the province. Now, if you only sell on Etsy, you do not need to worry about this. We'll get into why, but essentially Etsy will collect and remit PST for all of these provinces for you. They'll also do the QST, but apparently I read on a blog recently that Quebec did some updates to their QST, and now it kind of is the same thing as HST. So I don't know if Etsy's up to date on that, or whether Etsy is going to remit that QST for you. You will know based on whether or not Etsy charges your customer tax on their order. So if you have an order for Quebec and you look at the order on Etsy and it shows that they were charged a certain amount of sales tax, that means that's the amount of tax that Etsy is going to remit for you. So you don't need to worry about that. One thing to note, actually, I ran into with BC is that if you are selling in a category that is exempt from taxes or PST, like children's clothing in British Columbia, you don't have to pay PST on. And so I was wondering why I had a sale where PST wasn't charged to my customer, which means Etsy wasn't going to remit the PST on that. And then they looked into it and said, actually, it's a category thing. And that makes a ton of sense. It's a category that doesn't qualify for having PST on it. Okay, so those are our tax rates. If you don't only sell on Etsy, technically you need to register for PST and remit PST in BC, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, but I'm kind of wondering if they have something similar to the 30,000 rule, where if you don't do that many sales in that province, you don't have to register. But let's just stick to Etsy stuff. All right, Etsy's new effed up tax policies. So in 2022 of July, they decided to make things really nice and confusing and change things up, where essentially if you are registered to collect GST or have a registered taxpayer ID and you add it to your Etsy store, Etsy no longer collects taxes on your sales. You're supposed to account for that like in your product prices. So these were the three main changes that happened. Basically is that, yeah, if you're not registered to remit taxes in a certain area or jurisdiction, Etsy will collect the tax for you and remit it for you. So basically what happened is that Etsy came under scrutiny as a marketplace and needed to become a marketplace that collects and remits taxes, VAT, whatever you want to call it, in every jurisdiction, country, province that it is operating in, right? So if you have an order for the US, and I get a lot of US orders, you might notice that the customer has been charged tax. Of course, I don't remit any tax to any US state. So it's actually Etsy who's charging the tax on that and remitting it for you. You don't need to worry about it. The other thing is if you don't add a taxpayer ID number to your Etsy store, for example, you're not registered to collect GST, you're doing less than $30,000 in a year, Etsy again will collect and remit the GST for you. So the part that gets really confusing is like, Etsy's going to collect it for you, is the thing. But sometimes they won't collect it for you. So it's sort of weird because it's like if you're registered to collect tax, Etsy won't collect tax for you. But if you're not registered to collect tax, Etsy will collect tax for you, which is like, what? What did you just say? Yeah. So basically, people who are registered to collect tax, businesses, it's our responsibility to collect and remit tax on our sales. And Etsy's like, yeah, you can have that responsibility. Once you put your taxpayer ID in, we know that you're responsible for that. But if you don't, Etsy's on the hook for that. So they do their thing. Basically, so that's number one, Etsy will start collecting tax, all that. They're also going to start charging tax on our seller service fees. Great. And then they'll be getting rid of the old existing sales tax tool. I didn't have an Etsy store then, so I don't know what that's about. But basically, the things you need to know about taxes is that Etsy will collect taxes for you if you're not registered to collect tax. And also, if you are registered to collect tax, I don't know if this matters if you're registered or not. They're just going to start charging tax on their services, on the seller fees. Okay, so hopefully that's somewhat clear to you. That's kind of the end of this chapter here. Yeah, this is just kind of the details of, again, if you're registered to collect tax, Etsy won't collect the tax for you. If you're not registered to collect tax, Etsy will collect the tax for you. However, there's this weird clause at the bottom that says Etsy will collect PST from buyers in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, regardless of whether you're registered in these provinces or not. So again, that goes back to me saying you don't need to register in these provinces if you only sell on Etsy, which is honestly kind of a blessing. Because it's a pain to have to remit to every province. So no matter what, they are going to do the collection of the PST for Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and BC. All right, so we can get into the next chapter here, which is just, let's go over the Etsy fees, because now they're going to be charging taxes on them. So let's go over Etsy fees. Listing fee. So no matter whether your store is in Canadian or US dollars, the listing fee is always 20 cents US dollars. So on a recent statement that I have pulled up here, it was showing as a 27-cent fee because that's just how it converted that day to 27 cents in Canadian. There was also taxes on that fee, fun times. So basically they charged, tax, GST and PST on it because I'm in British Columbia. And so my actual total listing fee is now 30 cents, 3 of which was tax. Let's get into our fun little processing fee, right? So just like other payment processors like Stripe or PayPal or whatever, Etsy charges a payment processing fee. Unfortunately, you do need to use Etsy payments. If you're an Etsy seller in Canada, there's no option to like hook up a Square or a PayPal or any other payment processor. So you do need to pay processing fees. This is pretty standard on any credit card kind of accepting system. So the processing fee is 25 cents Canadian plus 3% of the total amount that they're processing. So this is the order amount plus the shipping plus the tax on it. This is just like the whole amount, the whole payment. Let's go into this tab here. So this is an order here. All of this relates to one order. So I got this from my monthly payment dashboard. I downloaded all the little transactions or items, activity, if you will, into a CSV. And this is what it looks like just for one day. And this is a day where I only did one sale. So it starts with our listing fee, right? So we just went over that. The listing fee is 20 cents in USD. So you can see here from my Etsy account, I'm now negative 27 cents. There's the tax on the listing fee. It was actually an auto renewal of a listing fee. So there's the tax on that. So my total listing fee there becomes 30 cents, 3 of which were tax. Next, we have the actual order. So the person made a purchase for an order. The total amount was $39.31. And so you can see this processing fee here, it applies to the entire $39.31. So let's go back to my little spreadsheet here, or my little PowerPoint here. So the payment total was $39.31. So again, we're going to calculate that 3%, which equals $1.18, and then we add that 25 cents. That brings us to our payment processing fee here. So as you can see, that is the total payment processing fee. So that again is a normal fee. You will see all the way up here, tax processing fee. There is tax on that. We'll get into a little bit later all the different tax situations. Right now I'm just going over the general Etsy fees. If you're familiar with the Etsy fees, you can just skip this part. Then we got our transaction fee. So Etsy charges 6.5% per transaction. That's basically like their commission of your sale. For whatever reason, they charge it per item and per shipping. So basically, the actual item cost was $30.99 and the shipping cost was $5.79. And then when you take 6.5% of that, you get these numbers, the $2.01 and the 37 cents. So I'll see that here on my transaction fees. So transaction fee for the shirt I sold, transaction fee for the shipping, and then later we get to see the tax on the transaction and shipping fee. You'll also see here that we have sales tax paid by buyer. Let me just make all this bigger for you guys. Sorry about that. Sales tax paid by buyer. So this was an order to the US. Again, I don't collect tax in the US or remit tax. So you can see the buyer was charged $2.57 in tax, and Etsy has subtracted that from my wallet, if you want to say that. You'll notice here on this Canadian order, there is no sales tax paid by buyer. So the reason for that is because I have my GST number listed there, and so they didn't charge GST on it because I'm expected to include that in my item price. So that's like the big takeaway, guys, is like Etsy is expecting you to somehow incorporate GST and HST at whatever rate it is for whatever province into the actual price of your item. But what you need to know basically is on this order, this total order of $41.98, technically 5% of that is GST that I collected on it, which is, again, Weird. Etsy's not going to collect it for me. I just need to do the backwards math to calculate how much of this sale was GST in order to remit that as GST that I collected. All this other tax stuff is GST that I paid, or taxes that I paid on Etsy's fees. Other taxable fees. Yay, guys, this is dry stuff. Currency conversion fee. So Etsy charges a 2.5% fee to convert currency, which means if you're a Canadian and you choose to set your currency to be US dollars, maybe all of your customers are US people, by selling and listing in US dollars, you actually incur a 2.5% conversion fee when they convert it to Canadian dollars before they drop it into your bank account. And you don't get a choice. They won't deposit it as US dollars and let your bank do the conversion. They're going to do the conversion for you, and then they're going to charge 2.5% on it. And this is a fee. Again, Etsy will charge taxes on all the fees. Speaking of offsite ad fees, so you might not know that these are on until you get a sale and then see that a huge commission is deducted because it was an offsite ad. You can turn this off unless you've done more than $10,000 in US in a 365-day period. Once you have done that, you cannot turn it off. It is set for life. Tax invoices, right? So what is the easiest way for you to report all of the taxes that Etsy has charged you as an expense, a business expense that you can submit as tax as a deductible, right? So you'll find it under finances, under your monthly statements. At the bottom here, under all that summary stuff, it'll say tax reporting. You can download it, and it basically shows you all the fees you paid to them, the commissions they took, and then also what they charged you in tax, right? So you know how much tax you paid, and you can separate that out and submit it for your expense, whatever. I'm not an accountant. We're not going to go into how to account. We're going into how to collect the information you need to provide your bookkeeper, or if you're doing it yourself, in order to do your year end. Taxes on fees. Yeah, I basically just went over this, which is that you're going to pay GST or GST and PST or HST based on your business address. They decide this based on which province your business address is in, and they charge you taxes. Yeah, they charge you tax on all the fees, transaction fees, processing fees, listing fees, and then I went over those extra sneaky fees that I kind of added in at the end there because I forgot about them. Currency conversion, ad spend, offsite ads. So this is my listing fee. We kind of already went over this, which is that Etsy charged me 12%, which is BC's GST and PST, on my 27-cent listing fee to get a total of 30 cents, and one of which cent is GST. So I'm only claiming the GST amount. And so when we go back into that report here, Etsy actually breaks down how much of which was GST and how much of which was PST when they charge you taxes. Hopefully you are in a better, I don't want to say better province, where they only have one tax rate, and so it's really not a biggie. So again, if you're doing accounting, basically you would show that, yep, my listing fee was 30 cents, one of which cent was GST, which I can claim. Same thing with the processing fees. So my payment processing fee came out to $1.43, and then they're going to charge tax on that. So here is the tax, 17 cents of $1.43 is 17 cents. Separate out the GST. Again, Etsy does this for you in the report, which is nice. So I get to claim 7 cents on that expense. All right, taxes on transaction fees. So it's the same thing. You get the idea, right? Basically in here, Etsy is showing you how much they charged you for the processing fee and then how much tax they charged on top of that. Again, I'm not an accountant. I don't know how accountants want this information, if they want it separated like this, but generally most accounting software that you might use, like QuickBooks or something like that, you enter the entire cost or the entire price. For example, your Etsy invoice, which you'll receive, it'll show like all the different fees, and then it'll show the tax total, and then it'll show you like the total. And so most of the time when you're doing accounting and stuff, you want to enter the total, and then you separate out the tax. So you say how much of it was GST, how much of it can be claimed. Yeah, thank God that's the end of it, guys. That's so overwhelming. right? A little bit. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the fees and taxes and whatnot. So basically, this all started because I downloaded my tax invoice. But basically, I was like, okay, well, what do I do with this? Is a subtotal, this is some tax, and this is some total tax. And I wanted to know what it was all about. At the end of the day, if you have an accountant, you can just submit this to your accountant. But of course, me being me, I was like, I need to know the nitty gritty of all this. And like, Etsy is charging tax, collecting tax, not collecting tax. How much are they taking out of what they pay me at the end of the day for tax? Yeah, it's a lot, guys. But sort of the really important thing to take away from here is that Etsy is expecting you to remit your own tax and factor in the tax in your listing price, because they're not going to charge your customer GST or HST, because once you're registered to collect those, it's your responsibility and not Etsy's responsibility, apparently. I don't know what you're supposed to do with that, because sometimes the tax rate is freaking like 15% and other times it's like 5%. So how you're supposed to factor that into your listing cost, don't know. But yeah, they're not going to collect HST or GST if you are a registered business that has to collect and remit GST. They're only going to collect the PST for you and remit that for you, which means you don't have to register for PST in those provinces because Etsy's doing it for you. But if you're registered for GST, you technically you have to report collecting GST on your Etsy sales, even though Etsy didn't collect it for you, or Etsy doesn't have a way for you to charge the customer taxes. Instead, we're just supposed to somehow factor in the cost of GST and just report ourselves as having collected GST or HST on the sale of items. So, that's not a happy fact that I discovered in this process. Just another sad thing about trying to do business in Canada as like a small business. It's just too bad. What you are responsible for is calculating how much of your sales is actually GST in order to report to the CRA how much GST or HST you collected on your sales this year in order to remit that to them. Yep. How you do that per sale? I'm going to create a spreadsheet for it, because basically what they suggest, Etsy suggests, is for you to download your entire list of orders and then filter them by Canadian orders and then filter them by province in order to determine which orders you collected which amount of GST or HST on. And obviously that would be super, super labor intensive to try and calculate. I mean, even with a spreadsheet, like labor intensive to try and calculate. So what I'm going to try and do for you guys is create a spreadsheet where all you have to do is copy and paste in a few things from these Etsy reports, so that if you're doing your GST return yourself, you can do that. Again, I'm not a tax professional. I am just me trying to figure out how to do stuff without having to pay for professionals, and this is my journey, guys. So I hope that brought you some more understanding of the intricacies of Etsy's taxes and why everybody is so outraged about the recent 2022 update. I'm sure you kind of wish you didn't know now. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. I know this is a long video, but for those of you who are interested, hopefully this gives you the information that you need. Otherwise, drop a comment below. I know I was like trying to look up how to read my Etsy tax invoice and I couldn't find any information on it. So hope this helps.